The entire arena goes silent the moment I raise my hand, and the sky turns black. 300 students, every professor in the academy, all of them staring at me like I just grew a second head. Because 5 seconds ago, I was the joke, the reject, the kid everyone voted least likely to survive his first dungeon. And now the ceiling is cracking, shadow is pouring out of my palm like ink dropped in water, and the strongest fighter in our year is on his knees in front of me, coughing up blood. Nobody saw this coming, including me, if I'm honest. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the humiliation that came first. My name is Dorian Vale, and 3 years ago I stood on the awakening stage in front of the entire academy, while a floating crystal read my soul, and decided what kind of person I was allowed to be. Some kids got Blade Saint, some got Flame Sovereign. My best friend Milo got Iron Vanguard and cried tears of actual joy. Then it was my turn. The crystal flickered, hesitated, and then, in a bored, flat voice, it announced my class to the entire auditorium. Support. Rank, lowest available. The room laughed. Not everyone, but enough. Enough that I still hear it sometimes when I close my eyes. My mother was in the crowd that day. I remember catching her face for half a second before the laughter drowned everything else out. She wasn't laughing. She looked almost relieved, which at the time I chalked up to a parent just being glad her son wasn't cursed with something monstrous or unstable. It would be years before I understood there was a very different reason behind that relief, but that's a problem for later. Right then, all I felt was the floor tilting under me, while 300 of my future classmates decided exactly who I was going to be for the rest of my life. I want to tell you I brushed it off. I didn't. I walked off that stage with my ears burning and my hands shaking, and I spent that entire first night convinced the crystal had made a mistake, that somewhere in the machine there was a glitch, something a professor could fix if I just asked the right one. Nobody fixed anything. The next morning I had a new schedule, a new uniform patch marking my class, and a permanent seat at the back of every training hall in the school. A support class in our world isn't inherently bad. Some supports become legends, keeping armies alive, turning the tide of wars nobody could win alone. But my specific skill, the one branded into my soul that day, was called Guardian's Echo, and it did something almost insulting in how small it was. It let me copy a fraction, a sliver, of another person's ability, and lend it back to them as a tiny buff. That's it. I couldn't attack. I couldn't defend myself. I could only make someone who was already strong slightly stronger for a few seconds. Everyone decided instantly what that meant. Free healer, human energy drink, a guy you keep around so your actual fighters don't die, but never someone you respect. It didn't help that Guardian's Echo on paper looked pathetic next to almost anything else that came out of that crystal that day. The instructors ran a mandatory demonstration 2 weeks after the ceremony, lining up every student to show off their new class in front of the entire year. Blade Saints cut training dummies in half. Flame Sovereigns lit the demonstration yard on fire, on purpose, for style points. When it was my turn, I echoed a borrowed spark of heat onto a torch that was already lit, making the flame flicker slightly brighter for exactly 4 seconds before fading back to normal. The silence that followed was somehow louder than the laughter had been at the ceremony. One instructor actually wrote negligible on his evaluation sheet and didn't bother lowering his voice while he said it out loud to the instructor next to him. After that, my schedule filled up with the same handful of duties, over and over, semester after semester. Stand near the frontline fighters, cast whatever tiny buff I could manage, retreat before anything dangerous got close enough to notice me. It wasn't training, not really. It was babysitting dressed up as curriculum, and everyone in that academy, myself included, had quietly accepted it as the natural order of things. And nobody decided it faster or louder than Kaine Draven. Kaine was the academy's golden monster. Rank 1 in our year, holder of the Draven family bloodline, a guy who could put a spear through solid rock without blinking. The first time we were paired for a training duel, he didn't even draw his weapon. He just looked at me, looked at the professor, and said the words that basically defined my first 2 years at that school. Why would I fight furniture? The class laughed again. I told you, it follows me. The professor, to his credit, tried to insist. Kane just shrugged and turned it into a joke instead, telling the whole training hall that fighting me would be like grading a test that was already blank, that there was nothing on the page worth marking. He didn't even say it cruelly. That was almost the worst part. He said it the way you'd state a fact about the weather, completely certain there was no argument to be had. Furniture didn't fight back. Furniture didn't have feelings to hurt, so why bother pretending otherwise? After that day, the nickname spread through the academy faster than I could keep up with. Some upperclassmen said it to my face, grinning like they'd invented something clever. Most just said it behind my back, low enough that they probably assumed I wouldn't hear, loud enough that I always did. I learned to walk through hallways with my eyes forward and my shoulders relaxed, because reacting only ever made it worse, and worse was a place I'd already visited enough times to know I didn't want to go back. I should have hated him for that. Honestly, some days I did, but mostly what I felt was worse than hate. It was the quiet, grinding humiliation of being sorted into a box labeled useless before I'd even had a chance to prove otherwise. Every training session, I got assigned to buff duty. Stand behind the real fighters. Cast my little sliver of borrowed power. Watch them win. Get thanked, sometimes, if I was lucky. Get ignored, mostly. The person I actually wanted to notice me was Celine Ashgrove, ranked second in our year, a frost duelist with a reputation for being untouchable in every sense of the word. She wasn't cruel like Kane. She was worse, in a way, because she was simply indifferent. To her, I wasn't even worth mocking. I was background noise, a prop in someone else's story. I first noticed her during a joint training session in our second semester, the kind where the whole year gets paired off to practice coordination drills nobody actually cares about. She'd been assigned to freeze a line of training constructs while her partner finished them off. And she did it so cleanly, so completely without effort, that half the yard stopped to watch. No wasted movement, no dramatic flair, just absolute, quiet control, like the cold obeyed her out of respect rather than command. I remember thinking that if the crystal had branded me with anything close to that, maybe none of this would have happened the way it did. She never mocked me the way Kaine did, she simply didn't see me, which some days felt worse. I existed somewhere below her notice, filed away in the same category as the training dummies and the spare equipment racks, present but irrelevant. I told myself that was fine. I told myself a lot of things were fine. Here's what nobody knew, including the crystal that judged me that day. Guardian's Echo had a second function buried so deep in its code that even the Academy's analysts missed it during my evaluation. It didn't just copy power, it stored it. Every fragment I borrowed, every sliver of someone else's strength I ever echoed, didn't disappear when the buff ended. It folded back into me, compressed, weighted. For 2 years, that storage sat almost empty, because the strongest thing I'd ever been allowed to touch was a third-year Fire Cadet's basic Ember spell, a drop in a bucket the size of an ocean. I didn't even know the storage function existed. Nobody did. Guardian's Echo had never been fully classified in the Academy archive to begin with, filed under a generic support subtype and left alone, because nobody with any authority considered it worth studying further. I spent those 2 years assuming I was simply weak, that the crystal had looked into my soul and found less there than it found in everyone else. It's a strange kind of grief, believing your own ceiling is lower than the people around you, and carrying that belief every single day without anyone ever telling you it might not be true. Then came the day everything changed, and it started with something as small as an assigned seating chart. The Academy ran a mandatory joint class dungeon simulation twice a year, first years through third years mixed together, meant to teach us how to survive real combat with strangers instead of friends. My group got stuck with Kane's squad. Of course it did. The universe has a cruel sense of humor. Great, Kaine said when the roster was posted. They're giving me a mascot. I said nothing. I'd learned by then that saying nothing hurt less than arguing and losing anyway. Milo, my one actual friend in that program, tried to talk me into requesting a transfer to a different squad. He'd been branded Iron Vanguard on the same stage where I got laughed at, and unlike most of the strong class students, he'd never once treated me like furniture. You don't have to keep taking it, he told me the night before the exercise, sitting on the edge of my bunk with the kind of frustrated worry only a real friend bothers with. Put in the request, say you're uncomfortable, nobody would blame you. They'd blame me, I said. They always find a way. He didn't argue, because he knew I was right. That's the quiet tragedy of being at the bottom of a hierarchy like ours. Even the people who want to help you can't always change the shape of the box you're stuck in. What I didn't know was that the professors had quietly upgraded the simulation that semester, feeding it live combat data from an actual breach that had happened in the eastern provinces 2 weeks earlier. A breach that, according to the report nobody bothered to fully read to the students, had been sealed by a task force after losing 4 operatives. We weren't walking into a simulation, We were walking into a recreation of something that had actually almost killed trained adults. At first, it played out like every other exercise. Kane charged in like he always did, arrogant and untouchable, carving through low-tier constructs with his spear, while the rest of us mopped up behind him. I did what I was assigned to do, echoed his strength, buffed his strikes, watched him grin like a king surveying his kingdom. For the first 20 minutes, it felt almost peaceful, in the specific miserable way these exercises always felt peaceful for me. Kaine cleared constructs in showy, efficient bursts, occasionally glancing back to make sure I was keeping his buffs topped up, never once thanking me for it. Celine handled the flanks alone, freezing anything that got too close before it became a real problem, moving through the chamber like she owned it. The two younger students in our group, a nervous pair of first years named Bram and Tess, mostly stayed behind me, which under normal circumstances would have been a joke in itself. The support hiding behind other supports. I remember thinking, somewhere in that stretch of routine combat, that maybe this was simply going to be my life. Standing in the back, buffing better people, watching from a safe distance while everyone else got to be the story. It wasn't a happy thought, but it had stopped being a devastating one a long time ago. I'd made peace with Small. Then the floor of the simulation chamber cracked open in a place it wasn't supposed to, and something climbed out that had never been part of the lesson plan. The instructors would later call it a data bleed, an unintended manifestation pulled through from the real breach event because the simulation's containment wasn't rated for that level of threat. In the moment, none of us knew what to call it, except terrifying. It was easily 3 times the size of anything we'd fought that day, plated in something like black glass, and the first thing it did was backhand Kaine Draven, the strongest fighter in our year, 30 feet into a stone pillar, screaming. Actual, real screaming, not simulation sound effects. Someone in the back of the group started sobbing. The safety wards that were supposed to shut the exercise down the second things got dangerous flickered and failed, because nothing about this was supposed to be possible. I remember the sound the pillar made when Kaine hit it. A deep, wet crack that didn't belong anywhere near a training exercise. I remember Bram grabbing Tess and pulling her behind an overturned pillar, both of them shaking so hard I could hear their armor rattling from 10 feet away. I remember thinking, with a strange, distant clarity, that this was the first time in 2 years I'd ever seen fear on Kaine Draven's face, even for a half-second, before it dissolved into that awful, motionless silence that follows real trauma. And Kaine, golden, untouchable Kaine, didn't get back up. Here's the part where I want to tell you I was brave. The truth is, I froze for a full 2 seconds, heart slamming so hard I could feel it in my teeth, every instinct screaming at me to run. But then I looked at Kaine's crumpled shape against the pillar, and past him, at Celine, who had put herself between the creature and 2 younger students, throwing ice wall after ice wall that were cracking faster than she could rebuild them. She wasn't going to last. None of us were. Every rational part of my brain told me to do exactly what I'd always done. Stay back. Stay small. Let the strong people handle the dangerous thing while I made myself useful at the edges, buffing whoever was left standing long enough for a rescue team to arrive. That instinct had kept me safe for 2 years. It had also kept me exactly where everyone expected me to stay. I don't remember deciding to move. I remember my body already running toward the one person in that room I probably had the least reason to save. I dropped to Kaine's side. His eyes were open, barely, glassy with shock, blood at the corner of his mouth, and for the first time in 2 years, he looked at me like I actually existed. "Get up," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "I need something to work with." "Get away from me," he managed, half a laugh, half a wheeze. "Go hide with the others, mascot." I should have listened. Instead, I grabbed his arm and activated Guardian's Echo at full output for the first time in my life. No holding back. No careful little sliver borrowed and returned. Somewhere behind me, I could hear Celine's ice wall cracking again, another few seconds before it shattered completely, and I remember thinking, with a strange, almost calm certainty, that there wasn't going to be a version of this moment where I got to be careful. I pulled everything the skill let me touch, every fragment of stored power I'd quietly banked for 2 years without knowing it, and slammed it into him at once. Something in my chest tore open like a dam giving way. Kane's eyes went wide. His strength didn't just return. It doubled, tripled. The spear in his hand ignited with raw force that hadn't been there a second earlier, a compressed echo of everything he was capable of, amplified by 2 years of stored fragments finally being spent all at once. He didn't question it. He didn't have time to. He surged up off the ground and drove that spear straight through the creature's shoulder plate, and for the first time since it appeared, the thing actually screamed. That should have been the end of the story. It wasn't, because the moment I emptied that stored power into Cain, something inside me shifted, a lock clicking open that had been sealed since the day the crystal branded me on that stage. Guardian's Echo wasn't done evolving. It had been waiting this whole time for a moment extreme enough to force the next stage awake, and apparently almost dying in a live fire dungeon breach qualified. The creature turned from Cain, wounded and furious, and came straight for me instead. I want to say I had some brilliant plan. I didn't. What happened was instinct, pure animal panic, combined with 2 years of quietly cataloging every power I'd ever brushed against. In that half second before it reached me, my mind did something it had never done before. It didn't just copy Kaine's strength. It copied everything, every fragment I'd ever stored, layered on top of each other. Celine's ice, Kaine's raw force, 3 semesters of borrowed embers and gusts, and tiny sparks from forgettable classmates I'd buffed on forgettable afternoons, all of it compressing into a single surge that had nowhere to go but out. The ceiling of the simulation chamber cracked. Shadow, dense and cold, tore out of my palm like something that had been trapped for years finally getting free. That's the moment I told you about at the start, the one where everyone stared at me like I'd grown a second head. Because Guardian's Echo, the useless little buff skill, the thing that made an entire academy laugh at me on my first day, had just done something no support class in the school's recorded history had ever done. It had turned raw, borrowed power into an original attack. The blast didn't just wound the creature, it ended the encounter in a single motion, punching straight through its core in a way that made the instructors watching through the observation glass go completely silent. I found out later that 2 of them actually dropped their tablets. Bram and Tess, still huddled behind their overturned pillar, stared at me like I'd swapped bodies with someone else entirely mid-battle. Even the creature's remains, dissolving into that strange black glass residue the analysts would spend a week studying, seemed almost like an afterthought compared to the silence that followed. Nobody moved for what felt like a full 10 seconds. Then Tess, of all people, the same nervous first year who'd spent the whole exercise hiding behind me, started clapping, shaky and disbelieving, like she wasn't entirely sure it was allowed. Kaine was on his knees a few feet from me, not from injury this time, but from something closer to disbelief. Blood still at his mouth, spear still smoking in his hand, staring at me like he was trying to reconcile the mascot he'd mocked for 2 years with the person who had just casually erased the thing that nearly killed him. "What?" he said slowly. "Was that?" I didn't have a clean answer. I still don't, not really. All I knew in that moment was that something inside me that had been quietly building for 2 years had finally found a reason to exist all at once, and it terrified me almost as much as it thrilled me. Celine lowered what was left of her cracked ice wall and looked at me the same way, except there was something else underneath the shock in her expression, something that looked uncomfortably close to interest. "You've been holding that back this whole time," she said. "It wasn't a question. I didn't know I had it," I told her, and for once, it was completely true. The instructors shut the simulation down immediately after that, streaming into the chamber with a speed that told me exactly how badly the failure had scared them. Medics swarmed Cain first, then Bram and Tess, then eventually me, checking my pulse and my eyes with the kind of urgency usually reserved for actual combat casualties, not support students who spent their days buffing torches. One of them kept glancing at the scorched, cracked ceiling above us, then back at me, like he couldn't make the 2 things fit together in his head. I heard fragments of the staff conversation on my way out, hushed but not hushed enough. Words like unregistered output. Words like, how did we miss this? Words like someone needs to notify the board tonight. None of it felt real yet. I was still shaking too hard to process what my own hands had just done. But rumors move faster than official reports, and by the time I made it back to the dormitories, half the school already knew something impossible had happened in that chamber. By the next morning, all 300 students knew. Kaine avoided me for 2 full days, which honestly might be the longest he'd gone without insulting me since we met. I caught him watching me once from across the dining hall, expression unreadable, before he turned back to his tray like he hadn't been caught at all. Milo joked that Cain was probably running the numbers over and over in his head, trying to find some version of events where the furniture comment still made sense. and failing every time. When Kane finally cornered me outside the training hall, I braced for another dose of the same arrogance I'd learned to expect. Instead, he just stood there, arms crossed, jaw tight, looking like a man trying to swallow something he didn't want to admit. "You saved my life," he said finally, like the words physically hurt coming out. "I know," I said, because I wasn't in a particularly forgiving mood after 2 years of, "Why would I fight furniture?" "I still don't understand what you did in there." "Neither do I admitted. "But I'm guessing we're both going to find out." He didn't apologize. Guys like Kane rarely do. Not with words anyway. But something in the way he nodded, short and stiff, told me the furniture comment was retired for good. What replaced it? I honestly wasn't sure yet. Respect maybe, or something closer to fear, dressed up to look like respect. "For what it's worth," he added, staring somewhere past my shoulder like the words were easier to say to the wall behind me, "I've spent 2 years assuming I knew exactly what everyone in this school was worth, just by looking at their patch. Turns out I was wrong about at least one of them." He paused, like he wanted to say more, then apparently decided that was already more honesty than he had budget for that week. "Don't let it go to your head, mascot." The old nickname landed differently this time. Less like an insult, more like a habit neither of us was ready to let go of yet. Celine found me later that same day, waiting outside the dormitory in a way that felt entirely too deliberate to be a coincidence. "The staff are going to want to test you," she said, no greeting, straight to business, which was very on brand for her. "Whatever that skill actually is, it's not registered anywhere in the archive. Do you understand what that means?" I didn't, not fully, but I understood enough to feel my stomach drop. In our world, unregistered meant one of two things. Either something so rare it hadn't been cataloged yet, which sounded exciting in theory and terrifying in practice, or something dangerous enough that whoever encountered it before never lived long enough to file a report. I had a sinking feeling I already knew which one applied to me, given how close Kaine had come to not surviving the thing I'd apparently been storing inside me for 2 years without knowing it. "It means I'm not just a support anymore," I said slowly. "It means I'm an anomaly." "It means," she said, and for the first time in 2 years there was something almost gentle in her voice, "that every faction in this academy who ignored you for 2 years is about to start paying very close attention. Some of them nicely, some of them not." "You say that like you already know which category you fall into," I said, mostly joking, mostly not. She didn't answer right away, which told me more than an actual answer would have. Instead, she looked at me for a long moment, the same clinical, assessing look she usually reserved for opponents worth taking seriously. And something about being looked at that way, after 2 years of being looked through, made my chest tighten in a way I wasn't prepared for. "I'm still deciding," she finally said, and walked away before I could ask what that meant. I should have felt triumphant. 2 years of humiliation, of being dismissed as furniture, of watching Kaine get all the glory while I stood in the back buffing his strikes, and finally, I had something undeniable. Proof that Guardian's Echo wasn't a joke branded onto the wrong person by a bored crystal. It was something the entire archive had never seen before. Instead, standing there with Celine, watching me with an expression I couldn't fully read, all I felt was a cold, creeping unease, the kind that settles into your stomach and refuses to leave, no matter how many times you tell yourself everything worked out fine in the end. Because if my skill really was unregistered, if it really was something new, that meant nobody, not the professors, not the archive, not even I, actually understood what it was going to cost me the next time I pushed it that far. For 2 days after that, life at the academy took on a strange, disorienting rhythm. Students who had never once acknowledged my existence suddenly went out of their way to greet me in the hallways, some of them with genuine curiosity, most of them with the transparent hope of getting close to whatever I had apparently become. Professors who used to write negligible on my evaluations without a second thought started requesting private meetings to discuss my development, which was academy language for admitting they had no idea what to do with me now. Milo found it hilarious, in the exhausted, relieved way only a real friend can find something hilarious. 2 years, he kept saying, shaking his head over dinner in the dining hall, ignoring the way half the room kept glancing our way. 2 years of watching them treat you like a footnote, and it takes one dungeon breach for the whole school to remember you exist. He wasn't wrong. It should have felt like victory. Mostly it felt like whiplash. And 2 days later, when a sealed letter arrived at the dormitory bearing a crest I didn't recognize, requesting my presence at a private evaluation with someone from outside the academy entirely, whatever fragile sense of victory I'd been building collapsed into something closer to dread. I understood, reading that letter twice under the dim light of my dorm room, that whatever guardian's echo had just woken up inside me, the people who mocked me for 2 years were about to be the least of my problems. The world had just found out the furniture could fight back. And somewhere out there, something far worse than Cain Draven had already started paying attention. The room smells like ozone and cold stone, and the second instructor Halvard Reyes tells me to activate Guardian's Echo at full output. The crystal set into the floor between us cracks down the middle like ice giving way under too much weight. Nobody warned me the test itself could be dangerous. I find that out the hard way, standing in a sealed evaluation chamber 3 stories beneath the Academy's east wing, watching hairline fractures spiderweb outward from my boots, while a scarred man in a gray coat watches me the way you'd watch a kettle that's been on the stove too long. "Stop," Reyes says, quiet and flat, and something about the way he says it makes me listen instantly. I stop. The fractures stop with me. My hands are shaking, and there's a thin line of blood at my nose that wasn't there 30 seconds ago, and Reyes just stands there writing something on a slate, without a single change in his expression, like he's seen exactly this kind of thing go much, much worse. Let me back up, because 2 days ago I didn't even know the Cinder Wardens existed. The letter had arrived sealed with a crest I didn't recognize, black wax pressed with the shape of a torch wrapped in chains, and it requested my presence at a private evaluation with, and I'm quoting the exact phrasing here because I read it about 11 times, a representative concerned with the classification and containment of unregistered soul skills. Containment. That word sat in my stomach like a stone for 2 straight days. Nobody uses containment for something they're proud of you having. Milo thought it sounded like a promotion. I thought it sounded like the Academy quietly handing me off to someone whose entire job was deciding whether people like me were safe to exist in public. Cain, when I told him, didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said the sentence that told me something had actually shifted between us, not just softened. "I'm coming with you." I laughed, because 2 weeks ago he wouldn't fight me, let alone escort me anywhere. "You weren't invited." "Wasn't invited to the dungeon breach either," he said. "Didn't stop me from almost dying in it." That was Kane's version of gratitude, apparently. Showing up uninvited and daring anyone to tell him otherwise. So that's how I ended up walking into the Cinder Warden evaluation with the Academy's golden monster trailing half a step behind me, arms crossed, jaw set, looking like he was personally prepared to fight an entire secret order if they so much as raised their voice at me. 2 weeks ago, the idea of Kaine Draven guarding me instead of mocking me would have sounded like a fever dream. Now it just felt like the world rearranging itself around a fact everyone was still catching up to. The chamber itself was nothing like I expected. No banners, no ceremony, just cold gray stone, a single crystal embedded in the floor, and a man leaning against the far wall who looked like he'd survived several wars and hadn't bothered mentioning any of them. Reyes was older than most of our instructors, with a scar cutting from his left eyebrow down to his jaw, and eyes that moved over me the way a butcher checks a cut of meat for the parts worth keeping. Not cruel, just assessing, like he already had a theory and was only here to confirm it. "Dorian Vale," he said, not really a question. "Sit." There was one chair. I sat. Cain stayed standing by the door, arms crossed, radiating the specific kind of silent threat that used to be aimed at me and was now, for once, aimed at someone else on my behalf. "You can't be in here," Reyes told him, without even looking up from his slate. "Try and make me leave," Kaine said. I expected Reyes to argue. Instead, something flickered across his scarred face that might have been the ghost of a smile. "Fine. Stand there and stay quiet. If the crystal cracks past the outer ring, you get out immediately. Understood? Loyalty doesn't stop a soul fracture from taking you down with him." Cain went very still at that. So did I. "What do you mean cracks?" I asked. "It's a test. Tests don't crack." "Most tests don't require this," Reyes said, and set a small, dull gray crystal into a groove in the floor between us. "This one measures how much of you is actually there to measure. Sit still. Give me a small pulse of your ability. Nothing close to what you used in the breach. A sliver. That's all I need to start." My stomach folded in on itself. A small pulse. Like Guardian's Echo had ever in 2 years done anything resembling small on command. "I don't really control the size," I admitted. It just sort of happens. Reyes's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened, like I'd confirmed something he already suspected and hoped he was wrong about. Try anyway, so I tried. I reached for that familiar, humiliating trickle of borrowed power, the one that used to make torches flicker brighter for 4 embarrassing seconds, and pulled it toward the surface the way I had 1,000 times in 2 years of buff duty. For a second, nothing happened. Then the crystal in the floor lit up and kept lighting, brighter and brighter, past the point where anything about this felt small. The floor cracked. Reyes's hand shot up. Stop. I stopped. My hands were shaking, blood at my nose. Kane had gone rigid by the door, one step forward like he was ready to physically drag me out of the room if the floor gave way entirely. Reyes crouched slowly and studied the fracture lines with a kind of grim, professional interest that made my skin crawl. That, he said, was not a small pulse. I told you I don't control the size. No, he said, you don't. Not yet. And that is exactly the problem I was afraid of. He straightened up, wiped a thin layer of dust off his coat, and looked at me the way you look at something you respect and fear in equal measure. Do you know what a vessel bearer is, Dorian? I didn't. The name meant nothing to me. Some archived term buried in a history I'd never had reason to study. I shook my head, and beside me, Kane shifted his weight, clearly hearing it for the first time too. Reyes exhaled slowly, like he was deciding how much to hand a person who wasn't ready for it and giving it to him anyway, because withholding it would be worse. Centuries ago, there was a class of soul-branded individuals capable of absorbing the power of anyone around them and unleashing it as their own, he said, not copying the way most support skills work. Absorbing, storing. Every fragment of strength they ever touched became part of a reservoir inside them that never stopped growing. In theory, given enough time and enough contact with strong allies, a vessel-bearer's ceiling was limitless. The word limitless landed strange in that cold stone room. Not exciting. Heavy, like a weight being set down on my chest. They don't exist anymore, Reyes continued. Not officially. The last confirmed vessel-bearer vanished from historical record almost 200 years ago, and every soul skill archive since then has treated the class as extinct, which is exactly why an unregistered skill matching every historical marker of one just tore open a training simulation floor 2 weeks ago, in front of 300 witnesses, belonging to a boy the awakening crystal branded as the lowest-ranked support in his year. I felt the blood drain out of my face. You think I'm one of them? I think, Reyes said carefully, that Guardian's Echo isn't a weak support skill that happens to store power as an odd side effect. I think it's the last known expression of an extinct class, wearing a disguise convincing enough that the crystal itself either mistook it or was designed to. That last part hung in the air a beat too long. Designed to. Like the crystal hadn't made a mistake at all. Why would anyone design a crystal to hide what I actually am? I asked, and my voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. Reyes's scarred face went unreadable, in a way that told me he had an answer and wasn't giving it to me yet. That, he said, is a question for another day, once I know you're stable enough to survive hearing the rest of it. Kane finally spoke from the doorway, voice tighter than I'd ever heard it. Survive hearing it. What does that mean? Reyes looked at him like he'd forgotten he was allowed to talk, then decided to answer anyway. It means vessel bearers historically had short lifespans, Draven. Every recorded case ended the same way. The reservoir grows faster than the body's ability to contain it, and eventually, the vessel breaks from the inside instead of the outside. He turned back to me, and for the first time since we'd walked in, something in his expression softened into what might have been pity, or might have been respect, or might have simply been the exhaustion of a man who'd seen this story end badly before. You have a ceiling, Dorian. Most people with your kind of gift never find it in time. They just keep pulling more, and more, and more, because it feels like strength right up until the moment it isn't. I need you to understand that before you decide to test the limits of what you did in that simulation chamber. The room felt colder after that. Not literally, but something in my chest had gone tight and cold in a way that had nothing to do with the stone walls. So what do? I asked. Just never use it again? No, Reyes said. That would be its own kind of death, slower and just as certain, because a gift this size doesn't sit quietly forever just because you ask it to. What you do is learn control before your reservoir grows past what your body can hold. There are old techniques, stabilization methods, developed specifically for cases like yours. Most of them are lost. A few fragments might still exist, buried in places nobody with any sense has gone looking in decades. And if I don't find them in time? Reyes didn't answer that one directly. He didn't need to. The silence did it for him. He gathered the dull gray crystal from the crack in the floor, tucked it into a leather case, and looked at me one last time before dismissing us both. "I'll be monitoring your development personally from here forward," he said. "The Cinder Wardens exist because unregistered anomalies tend to attract attention from people far worse than a scarred old instructor asking careful questions. I'd rather find you first." That sentence followed me the whole walk back through the Academy's lower halls, Kaine silent beside me for once, clearly turning something over in his own head that he wasn't ready to say out loud yet. We found Celine waiting outside the archive wing, arms crossed, looking like she'd been standing there long enough to memorize the pattern of the stonework. "You look like someone just told you the sky is a different color than you thought," she said, studying my face with that clinical assessment she reserved for opponents worth taking seriously. "Something like that," I admitted. She fell into step beside us without being asked, which from Celine Ashgrove was practically an open declaration of loyalty. "I spent the day in the archive," she said. "After what you did in the simulation, I had a feeling the answer wasn't going to be in any modern classification record." I was right. "And?" Kaine asked, the first thing he'd said since we left the evaluation chamber. Celine's expression tightened, the kind of controlled stillness she used when something actually bothered her, and she refused to show it fully. "There's exactly one confirmed vessel bearer in the last 3 centuries of Academy record. A single line in a restricted archive index, most of the actual file redacted or missing entirely." She looked at me directly then, cold blue eyes steady despite whatever she was about to say. "The last known vessel-bearer disappeared under classified circumstances almost 200 years ago. Not died, disappeared. No body, no confirmed cause, just an official note that the case was closed by order higher than the archive itself." The hallway suddenly felt very narrow. "Closed by whom?" I asked. "That part," Celine said, "was the redacted portion." Nobody said anything for a long moment. Kane's jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter. I just stood there, trying to make my chest stop feeling like it had a second heartbeat pounding somewhere underneath the first one. A heartbeat that belonged to 200 years of history I'd apparently just inherited without ever being told. "So somebody erased the last person like me," I said slowly, "and didn't want a record of why. Or somebody protected the last person like you," Celine said, "by making it look like an erasure. There's a difference, and right now we don't know which one we're looking at." That single sentence did something strange to the fear sitting in my chest. Reshaped it, without fully removing it. Reyes's warning about a ceiling most people never survive should have been the heaviest thing on my mind that night. Instead, I lay awake staring at the cracked patch of ceiling above my bunk, thinking about a single redacted line in a restricted archive, about a class of people the world had decided to forget, about a crystal that might have lied to me on purpose 3 years ago for reasons nobody was ready to explain yet. Milo found me still awake near midnight, sitting on the edge of my bunk instead of lying in it, staring at nothing. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, dropping onto the end of the bed uninvited, the way he always did when he could tell something was actually wrong instead of just tired. "Worse," I told him. "I think I might be one. Or related to one. I'm honestly not sure which yet." I told him everything. The crystal cracking under a pulse I couldn't control, the word vessel-bearer landing in that cold stone room like a verdict, the ceiling Reyes warned me about, the ancient stabilization technique that might not even exist anymore, the single redacted archive line Celine had found. Milo listened without interrupting, which for him was its own kind of miracle, and when I finished, he sat quiet for a long moment before saying the thing that somehow made all of it feel slightly less unbearable. "2 years ago they called you furniture," he said. "Now there's an instructor from a secret order personally monitoring your development, and an ancient extinct class with your name basically stamped on it. Whatever this turns into, Dorian, you're not disappearing quietly into a back room ever again. I don't think the world's going to let you, even if you wanted it to." I wanted to believe that sounded like good news. Standing at the edge of something this big, with a ceiling I couldn't see, and a body that might not survive finding it, good news felt like the wrong description entirely. 3 days later, another message arrived, this one not sealed in wax but delivered directly by Reyes himself. standing in the doorway of my dorm room with that same unreadable, scarred expression. "I've requested a formal stabilization consultation from the archive division," he said without preamble. "It's going to take time to locate any surviving fragments of the technique your class historically relied on. In the meantime, I need you to promise me something, Dorian, and I need you to actually mean it." "What?" "Do not push Guardian's Echo past what you did in that evaluation chamber. Not for training. Not to prove something to Draven or the rest of this school. Not even in an emergency if you can help it. Every fragment you store makes the reservoir larger. Every time you pull from it recklessly without a stabilization method behind you, you shorten however much time we have to find one." I thought about the fracture lines spreading across stone floor from a pulse I hadn't even meant to make large. I thought about 200 years of silence hiding whatever actually happened to the last person who'd carried this same gift. I thought about the word disappeared, and how much worse that sounded than simply dying, because dying at least came with an ending. "And if I can't help it," I asked quietly, "if something happens again like it did in the simulation, and there's no time to be careful?" Reyes looked at me for a long, heavy moment, and for the first time since I'd met him, the calm professional certainty in his scarred face cracked just slightly at the edges, revealing something closer to genuine concern underneath. "Then you'll find out exactly what your ceiling looks like," he said, "and we will not have found a way to stop what happens after that yet." He left without another word, footsteps fading down the corridor, and I stood there in the doorway of my own dorm room, feeling the full weight of what he'd just told me settle into my chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples out in every direction I couldn't yet see the edges of. 2 years ago, the worst thing in my life had been a crystal calling me weak in front of 300 people. Now the worst thing in my life was a warning from a man who hunted anomalies for a living, telling me that the power hiding inside me for 2 years wasn't just rare. It was a countdown. And somewhere out past the walls of this academy, in a redacted archive line 2 centuries old, the only other person who had ever carried what I carried had vanished without explanation, without a body, without an ending anyone was willing to write down. I didn't know yet whether that silence meant I was being protected, or simply that I was next.